growing a podcast in 2024 looks very different than it did 10 years ago and even 5 years ago. So in order to keep up with industry news and trends, podcast conferences, just like in any other industry, do provide a lot of insights into what's going to happen. And so I just attended Podcast Movement Evolutions in LA this past month. And so I wanted to share with you what main takeaways were shared during the conferences and what you should be keeping an eye out just later in the year so that you know what to prepare for and if it makes sense for you. So let's dive into this week's episode of the Podcast Space, which is the show dedicated to help you use your podcast as the most effective tool in your business. I'm Xavier, and let's go right into it. If you followed me on Instagram, I showed you a lot of what was going on in the conference, and I also gave you a lot of FOMO. Sorry, not sorry. But I decided to compile the top trends that I noticed on Podcast Movement, companies that shared what they had coming up, but also what was kind of like a theme among a ton of different presentations. So in order to stay relevant, in order to grow your show, we're going to cover a few things. Obviously, artificial intelligence, AI, podcast discovery, ways to engage with new audiences, video podcasting, and monetization. So let's start with the first one. Should your podcast exist in other languages? So this is something that I get asked a lot because I am a multilingual professional and I do consult with a lot of podcasts in English, in Spanish, and in Portuguese. So I saw that there was a session on this. It was hosted by Martina Castro. I might as well say it in Spanish, right? From Adonde Media. So this production company is specialized toward multilingual content. Like, for instance, they work with Duolingo and a bunch of other companies. And so in case you missed this, Spotify at the end of last year actually announced that they were working on AI to basically take your voice and translate it into different languages. And so they have been really quiet about that. And so Martina was talking about what the work they've done. And so what are some options if you want to create podcast in a different language? By the way, she said, yes, your podcast should exist in a different language, but she gives us a few options. So basically she looked at if you just want to use the AI-based kind of like translation. And it was really interesting to see because honestly, it was translated from English to Spanish and it was not it. So if you're thinking that you can just toggle a button and get your content translated into different languages, we're not there yet. You could really see that it was a little wonky where the translations didn't make sense. So if you don't know any other languages, your content could be translated into really weird ways. So, if you wanted to do that, there was some risk, or you just got to wait for a few more, I don't know, maybe a year or so until the technology is really ironed out. But what she did say is that if you wanted to create a new transcript or just look at the episodes differently, that was a really good opportunity where you could actually reinvent the concept of that podcast into something else where you could pay attention to the specificity of that country. She said, if you do have, for instance, the capacity to invest in having translators look at a script and then have people voice it for you, that would make a ton of sense. And they actually created a few podcast episodes and projects that were really successful. But, she does say that it's better to innovate and not create like a cookie cutter solution, like a literal translation. Now, something that I thought was really interesting is considering, like, if you do speak another language. For instance, I speak Portuguese and Spanish. I'm a native speaker in Portuguese. And something that I always thought about, like, well, does it make sense to have the podcast space as a Portuguese version? And I don't have the capacity to do so, to be honest. So I may or may not look into the AI version. I just know that I have no capacity for it. But a great example of someone who's doing it and doing it very well is Yesenia Bocanegra, who was a guest on the show multiple times. She's so wonderful, and she's a clear example of how she's creating content both in English and in Spanish, and she's really successful at it. So check out her podcast. I'll make sure I include the links in the show notes. So let's move into number 2, podcast ads. Another huge question that people ask me: should I add an ad to my show? Does it make sense? Am I gonna get, my audience annoyed at me? And Tom Webster from Sounds Profitable shared that on his keynote that 85% of people who they surveyed about ads in podcasts and YouTube Premium said that they like or they actually didn't mind ads. So they said that it had to be crafted specifically for podcast audiences. So they couldn't be your traditional radio advert. It had to be almost like baked in a way that felt exciting and almost like non-obvious. People were also sharing that ads with some humor to it were also like welcomed. So if you're thinking that you want to incorporate ads from your own products and services, or even from, ad spots for companies, definitely something that audiences are not saying no about. Another note on podcast ads is that podcasting, Tom Webster shared, is extremely effective for lower funnel measurement. So basically awareness. And so the goal of brands with ads is not necessarily to just get ads out there. Brands want to get the attention of podcast audiences. And as we know, people are just not listening to podcasts just randomly like, hey, let me select these podcasts. So they land on our show because they want to be there. They're extremely tailored to the interest of what we're talking about. And so brands understand that. So if you've been toying around with the idea of onboarding sponsors and getting ads on the show, or including on your podcast your own products and services, that's definitely something that will help your audience get awareness about what you do. And then last thing about ads. So this was actually something that my friend Jay Yao shared with me, that he heard from Hala at Yap Media's presentation, that longer mid-roll, so basically have the pre-roll, the mid-roll, and the post-roll. So these are the types of ads that run in the beginning, middle, and end of the show. So in the middle, they tend to perform better, and they actually can sell for higher. And so basically, if you're thinking about selling a spot, the middle is where people are like more invested on the content. So it just makes sense. All right, moving on to podcast engine optimization. So SEO for podcast platforms. This was an interesting presentation. So basically, this was hosted by Maxime Piquet at Osha, which is a podcast hosting platform. And they were making the differentiation between Spotify and Apple Podcasts and how those algorithms work differently from one another. So these are some takeaways that I'm going to be talking about very slowly because there's a few numbers, but this is really important. So you should avoid using generic words in your show name. And I'll give you an example in a second. And when you avoid generic words, your show name can be boosted up to 4 times, right? So it's really important that you don't do that you don't pick generic words such as the podcast space. So the THE, it holds no meaning. Like, it's one of those words that some search engines actually almost like deleted. Basically, that counts as 0 for the search terms. And so podcast, how many podcasts do you know that have the word podcast on it? And space is a very generic word. If I was just to rely on having the show being discovered on podcast platforms and I did nothing else, it would be really difficult to rank for what I want. So basically, just know that what I'm doing is making sure that I'm doing my email marketing, I'm showing up on social media, and I'm guesting on a ton of different shows to make up for that thing that isn't great. The second discovery that they shared was that 67% of podcasts on top 100 use a keyword that they're trying to rank for on the podcast's name itself. So basically, the most popular shows are using the keywords that their listeners are searching for. And 70% of the podcasts on the top 10 use the keyword in their name. So basically, looking at 67% for shows on the top 100 and 74%, a higher percentage of those shows use the keywords in the name of the podcast itself. So again, look at the name of the podcast that you're thinking about or that you have. If the reason why you're not being found and if you're struggling to grow your show, it may be because the name of the podcast isn't obvious. Last but not least, on Spotify, the average podcast position increased by 5 times. So basically that improved how they were showing up when the show's description included a keyword 5 times. So the show's description, like, you can extensively write about the show. And I feel like as a consultant, when I'm doing audits, one of the major mistakes is that people just are very brief. This podcast is about X. Oh, this is a show hosted by so-and-so about this one thing. And so one, it doesn't tell sometimes a lot of things about the show. It doesn't share how frequently the episodes are released, what we can expect. Is this a solo show? Is this an interview show? Is this a show for business owners, for moms? What is this show for, right? So when you're looking at the keywords that you're trying to rank, are the keywords even included in your show's description? So something to consider. Now, AI. I feel like AI has been so, with anything in life these days, dividing people, right? Like you have the people who are like using AI for everything and people who are like, I'm a purist. I'm not using AI for anything. It doesn't get me. This is like almost like, it's the lazy's guide to podcasting, right? So people are still a little cautious about it. However, this is a takeaway from my friend Jay. He also told me that ad sellers are still skeptical about it, especially automating everything about it. And podcasters are yet to embrace it through the various stages of production. But in the near future, like AI really will be like the perfect assistant for podcasters and producers. I mean, we already see how much time we're saving by doing some of these things, right? Like incorporating a ton of show notes. It took me forever to write show notes before. Now I'm spending way less time on this. So just thinking about how our workflows will change and not fighting it. Honestly, if you've been on the fence, start by implementing baby steps and your future self will thank you. Now, moving on to a tool that is actually very heavy on AI that I personally use for the podcast, and it has been a lifesaver, and that is Descript. So at the session that Jay spoke at, he was talking about workflows and how to streamline and how to create better and faster workflows. And so basically he was predicting that Descript, the tool that I use to edit these podcasts with, will become like the Canva of podcasting. So it will become the mainstream tool used in industry teams to collaborate. So if I onboard an editor, I can work on the script, send the notes, and basically instead of having like a Word document where I have like timestamps to edit, they can just see I'm highlighting things and they work in it immediately. So that has been something that like Descript, they have been beefing up a lot of the things that they offer. Like they offer show notes, titles, a ton of stuff based on AI, like for instance, suggesting timestamps and keywords. Also, like sometimes there's one feature that I don't always use, but you can toggle it and it will basically edit the show for brevity. So basically remove mistakes. If I'm doing multiple takes, it will remove all of those. So it has been really cool. And so even for myself as a single user, and if I was to work with someone else. All right, moving on to YouTube and video podcasting. This have, honestly, like a lot of people are asking me, should I be on YouTube? Does it make sense for me to have my show on YouTube? Yes, your podcast should be 100% on YouTube. And I'm going to be sharing some takeaways and really exciting news from Kai Chuck at YouTube. On his keynote, he shared that YouTube is highly focused on improving the user experience between its own ecosystem of YouTube. So basically trying to create a seamless experience if you're in the car, if you are, on YouTube Music, or if you are at home or on your desktop. So these are very different types of surfaces. And people have really complained a lot about like how YouTube Music isn't very obvious sometimes, that people are like listening to podcasts. Is this like a video podcast? Do I want to listen to the video only? If I'm driving, right? Like I maybe only want to use less data and want to listen to the audio only version. So there's a lot that has been just in the news. And so episode 12, I'm talking about the considerations that you need to think about if you want to do a video podcast. And honestly, that's a really, really important one, because a lot of people think that they have to create like the most complex podcast episode. Like, again, this is the clear episode where there's low production value. I'm talking about the things that you need to know. However, YouTube is very aware that there's a lot of people that are not using YouTube and that they want to, because there's 2 billion users on the platform every single day, right? And so podcast discovery is something that as podcasters we struggle with, right? We complain that it's really hard to get discovered by new audiences. And while there's a lot of different ways to fix the lack of organic discovery, which is something that I do with podcasters. We look at alternative ways to grow. YouTube really is like the easiest solution because it's a search engine. And so you definitely need to look into 2024. And one big change that they're going to be doing that they are testing is creating a YouTube API. So basically, API is having like a piece of technology that connects YouTube to your podcast hosting platform, because until now you had to look at the analytics on podcast hosting platforms and then look at your YouTube analytics and combine those, and the metrics don't even like match. So that was something that people have complained about, especially if you have ads or if you have more strategic ideas that you're trying to figure out and make sense of. They definitely want to make YouTube a two-way communication. So I, for instance, have to upload the podcast to my hosting platform, Captivate, which, by the way, I recommend. A thumbs up for them. I do have an affiliate link in the show notes because I really love what the platform offers. And so I upload the content, the audio version to Captivate, and then I upload the video version to YouTube. So it's a lot of work. And so what they're wanting to do is, and they're going to be testing it with Headliner, Omni Studio, Libsyn Ads, and Red Circle. So they're going to be testing how those platforms speak to one another to simplify our lives. So that is all good news. Now, they do say that, as YouTube drives discoverability and consumption for overall content and podcasts, they really want to help people who, especially the people who love having like a video playing in the background, to really discover new shows, for instance. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, the percentage is about 60% of new podcast listeners, or should I say people who are new to podcasting, they actually start with video podcasts. They don't start with audio podcasts anymore. They get into video podcasting. So again, video podcasting, definitely think not going to go away. And YouTube is making it all easier for us. So excellent news. Now, another thing is going to be focused more on community and content. So my friend Brianna, she's a producer and host of What's Good podcast. And I asked her, hey, what were the two takeaways for you from Podcast Movement? And what should people be paying attention to? So she said that being vulnerable and honest on your podcast makes your content more relatable. But what she thought was interesting is that it kind of goes beyond you as the host. Making relatable content really helps your community connect with one another. So if you're trying to create a community from your show, really being open, talking about the struggles, talking about things that are relatable to your audience is going to help build that community that you're looking for. And also, repurposing is still the word on the street. So one episode can still really feed the rest of your content strategy. That was something that she heard a few times. I agree. 2 years ago, I already created a podcast course called Maximize Your Podcast Content, which I will link in the show notes, to really teach you how you can, without overwhelm, craft content that feeds your ecosystem, that you're showing up consistently and just getting more visibility from the right people without burning out. So I am glad that people are still talking about the importance of maximizing your podcast content. Moving on to number 8, podcast audiences continue to grow. According to the Infinite Dial, which is an annual survey by Edison Research, it grew 12% year on year. Podcast audiences continue to grow, and this year, it grew by 12%. A lot of people are still thinking, am I too late for the podcast game? No, you're not. You're not too late, because podcast audiences continue to grow, and this is my favorite fact. The growth in reach was actually driven by a large increase among the number of female listeners, which I absolutely love. This is so exciting. And also, if you are a podcast host who, you may be feeling disheartened because your podcast isn't growing, there are women out there listening and that need your show. We need to iron out your discoverability. That's what you're struggling with. But audiences are there. And if that's your audience, women are listening. But also, if you're a podcast listener and you're a woman and you're thinking, should I start a podcast? Yes, you should start a podcast. You're not too late to the game. Another one that I thought was really interesting about podcast audiences growth was that the number of monthly and weekly podcast listeners increased across all age groups. So if you're talking to boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, everyone is listening to podcasts. So let's go. And then last but not least, this all estimates to 218 million people in the US. So that makes up about 76% of those in the US that are older than 12 years old, right? So the highest ever number of podcast listeners. So yes, there is an audience for you. And yes, we can figure it out on how to get it done. So let's talk if you're not too sure. Now, mentioned across the conference, I thought it was really interesting, was cross-promoting shows and guesting. And those two I've talked about before many times on the show, how those are super important to grow your show organically, to convert podcast audiences onto your show. There's no better way to convert someone who already listens to podcasts, and especially picking people who have interests in whatever you're talking about already. So for instance, something that I do here at the podcast space, I guest on shows that are about marketing, shows that are about building your online authority. And I talk about on the topic of podcasting. I do podcast guest on podcasts that are about podcasting, but I do convert a lot of new listeners from people who don't have a podcast about podcasting, because the reality is a lot of people have wondered, is the podcast right for my marketing? And so I know that if I'm wanting to talk to multilinguals, minorities, and women, they will listen to me talk about podcasting on someone else's show, and they'll be like, yeah, I am curious. Let's go and listen. And so definitely something that is worthwhile continuing to do. And if it hasn't brought results to you, maybe it's the type of shows they are selecting and being on that it's really hard to make that conversion into your show. And then last but not least, let's talk about how you can grow listener engagement on social media for your current and potential listeners. So this is what I talked about at Podcast Movement. Yes, I'm going to plug myself. Of course I am. Because I just see so many people doing this wrong. I used a stat from Cumulus Media and Signal Hill Podcast Download Fall 2023 report. They asked podcast listeners if they followed their favorite podcast host on social media, and 56% said yes. So I'm sorry if you've been complaining that your listeners are not using social media anymore. You are wrong, my friend. You are choosing to say that because the people have spoken. Now, of course, they literally said your favorite podcast host. People listen to a lot of different shows. They may not choose to watch you on social media. So again, for instance, on these podcasts, I'm always saying, talk to me on social media, go on Instagram, let's chat. I'm there for you. I want to celebrate with you, right? So really revisit what you've been doing on the show, how you've been talking to your audience. And so I want to share a couple of more things. Is getting the basics right. So what did people say? Where did they follow their hosts on social media? They said Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. These were the three main platforms. And I hear all the time people talking about how their Instagram reach is garbage, how Facebook is a graveyard for content, when in reality, I think that you have to ask yourself, what type of content have you been creating? Because deep down, people will only seek us for three things. People want to be inspired, educated, and entertained. And if your content is not doing any of these three things, that's why people are not engaging. Clear example of this, my nemesis post. Picture it, a podcast cover art that has your picture, the title of the podcast episode, and then below, on the caption, you just say, new episode, listen now. Does that ring a bell? That is exactly why you're struggling with engagement, because this type of post is not doing any of the above. This type of post is basically the equivalent of you being in an office and your coworker tapping you on the shoulder and going, hey, don't forget that we have a meeting in 10 minutes. And you go, cool, thanks for the nudge. That's it. You're not supposed to do anything. You're just supposed to know that there's something coming up, and when that thing is ready, you're going to go, right? That's exactly the same thing. You're basically just saying, hey, new episode, whenever you open your podcast app, go listen. So how can we create better podcast content that are teasers, but also that inform the audience where they are, that creates that need to engage with us like human beings? And creating content that is authentic, feels exciting, and inspires people while entertaining them is the key for this. So traditional podcast cover art, boring captions, that's why you're not getting any listener engagement. I mean, you already struggle with getting engagement directly through the show, right? You're already talking and telling me all the time because these are things that I hear. I'm not getting any engagement. I don't know if my audience likes this episode. So let's try something different in 2024. And it's not really about the format. It's not that you have to go full on with video. It's really about the quality of the content that we are providing and tailoring the format of the piece of content, my goodness, to the content itself. So if you follow me on Instagram at the podcast space, you can often see that sometimes I do carousels. And if I'm doing a multi-page carousel post, basically what I'm doing is I'm diving deeper into one topic and breaking it down into multiple things. The type of engagement on these posts is going to be completely different than if it's a static image or if it is a video. Videos are normally pushed to new audiences, particularly on Instagram. And basically what we're trying to do is to contextualize who we are and why they need to care. A lot of people don't provide enough context. And so in 2024 is the year that you treat your social media for the podcast as your personal social media. You're bringing people along, you're getting them excited. So if this is something that you're struggling with and you want to help with, and I am here for you, just drop me a message. You have the links in the show notes about the episodes referenced in this episode, as well as the courses that I have, all the things that I talked about, including, yes, a link to my Instagram. Just go onto the show notes and you'll be able to access those immediately. And I'll see you in the next episode. Just keep creating content that's imperfect, but moves you forward. Bye.